The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets about what matters most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
It's much easier to say to somebody, here's what you believe, and here's why you're right, than to say, here's what you believe, and here's why you're wrong. Now, persuasion is usually only something you try and do because you think they are wrong about something, even if it's a fairly trivial thing. But starting by saying, this instinct you have that X is true is a good one, but it only follows from this other thing, but because I now know what you believe, where I agree with you, I can then start there and work back to the thing that must therefore also be true. And so the better we understand that story or those cultural waters we're swimming in, the more likely we are to find connection points.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Andrew Wilson is teaching pastor at King's Church London and has degrees in history and theology from Cambridge and King's College London. He is a columnist for Christianity Today and has written several books. The most recent is Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. I agree with historian Mark Noll, who wrote, Andrew Wilson's book is extraordinary in every way. Extraordinary in the breadth of research, extraordinary in the multitude of world-significant events that Wilson identifies for 1776, extraordinary in the depth of his insight on what those events meant and continue to mean, extraordinary in the verve with which he makes his arguments, and not least, extraordinary in the persuasive Christian framework in which he sets the book. Remaking the World is a triumph of both creative historical analysis and winsome Christian interpretation. Andrew Wilson, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. I love your book, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be with you.
I have to say, when I saw that subtitle, 1776, post-Christian, I was a little suspicious, right? I mean, this just, the language of post-Christian is so often the sort of language of catastrophizing, of doom. And then the 1776, I just assumed, okay, we're just talking about the American Revolution here. I'd never put together how many huge things were happening in 1776. You identify about 10 major events and cultural moments like Gibbon's rise, is it the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That all this was going on in 1776. It's not just
the steam engine. I think is massive. The start of early Romantic movements, and it's just such a fascinating period of history. And obviously, partly the subtitle is a little facetious. It's probably designed to create the impression you got, which is just partly to draw Americans in. Go, oh, okay, well, I hope this isn't a British guy saying that the American Revolution is to blame for everything. But obviously it's not. Most of the book isn't, as you know, isn't about America. And I think we want to give its due to that important moment in political terms, but also to say there's a load of other stuff going on here. It's just it seems to be one of those years. There's probably one or two others, I would say, 1492, 1453, a couple of years in history where a whole lot changes in one 12-month period. But I do think 1776 is nearly unique in the range of different things that are going on and the amount of reverberations they still have in the modern world.
Yeah. Okay. So you use the acronym WEIRDer to describe our world. And I think weird the weird acronym is not original to you. Maybe the ER at the end is from you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So weird on its own is has been around for 10 or 15 years in psychology circles as a way of describing, to be honest, people like you and me, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, to which I've added the E and the R, ex-Christian and romantic, which are more to do with ideologies and sort of intellectual and emotional undercurrents to the modern world, whereas the five that the psychologists talk about are more to do with institutional and material conditions. So it's a way of trying to slightly broaden the terminology and to include Christianity, which obviously I'm very interested in, but Romanticism as well as a sort of intellectual, artistic movement, which I think is a very important part of the way that modern Western people think as well. Yeah,
I definitely want to get to that in just a minute. And the convenience of this acronym WEIRD or WEIRDer is a reminder to us that our way of seeing the world, which seems perfectly normal to us, is not normal at all in the sweep of history.
Yeah, I mean, that I think in a weird way, and it's clearly Freudian stuff. In a way, it becomes very obvious as soon as you travel. So as soon as you go, as soon as you interact, certainly with someone who's not at all from your normal milieu. If you or I was just to get parachuted into, some large city in China that you and I might struggle to spell if we heard its name, Zhengzhou or something, you just get plonked there. Try and find your way. And you'd realize this is not just an issue of language. There's just so many assumptions about the world that are not shared here. Some of them are. Some of the technology is actually almost identical, but the values are very different. And the way people think about the home and the self and marriage and work and parenting and almost everything that matters, certainly God, they all matter. And actually, to a limited degree, obviously I'm European, so it's much easier to travel to lots of very different countries from where I live than probably from where you and most of your listeners do. But you're just continually interacting with people who don't share quite basic assumptions. But I think in this book, I'm trying to stand back from that and almost challenge at a deeper level, even the fact that I'm going to have some slightly silly ones, but even the fact that there's a flush toilet within 30 seconds of where you're sitting right now is an extremely unusual development. And that makes a big difference to the way you see the world. Interestingly, the kind of toilet you have in your home was invented in 1775. But there's many, many things like that. Like, there are so many very quite basic things that you hold that you think, I didn't even realize most people didn't think about that or think that way until you interact with someone who's very different, or someone, of course, who's dead, which is much of what you do when you write about the past. And then think this is a very small, even today, as a small section of the global population, let alone across history. So I found that fascinating too as I was looking into it.
What are a couple of things that you have in mind when you think that we have don't even think about it being so unusual or
Well, I think so. So a few good examples. I think the way that we think about the self and the way that we think about the individual. I think it would almost be impossible for people today to conceive of how you wouldn't think that an individual's destiny and agenda for their own life was immeasurably more important than what their community expected of them.
Yeah.
But that is very unusual. And still, a lot of people in the world today find Western individualism very hard to understand. And the self-centeredness, by which I don't just mean selfish in a childish way, but I mean the idea that our world is just constructed around the self is a very odd belief to many, many people. And you wouldn't have to travel very far from where I live I'll be seeing friends in a couple of weeks from, Palestine or Armenia or Turkey or whatever, but who they kind of know it because they're smart people who understand a bit Western, but they do find it odd. The idea of community obligations being almost irrelevant. The plot of Romeo and Juliet, your family thinks you should marry this person, but you really in your heart want to marry that person, so go, you knock yourself out, girlfriend. That kind of narrative, which is so central to Western people, it just seems very like they wouldn't see the Capulets as the bad guys in that story, and there's so many examples like that. It isn't how people think about the world. Their stories don't work that way. Their playlists don't work that way. Yeah, and so that would be a very basic one that people almost find it hard to imagine. What the arguments that we had 100 years ago about voting weren't, about do women vote, whatever, were not really arguments about are men better than women. And by and large, they were actually often votes about should families come together and agree what they believe. A lot of the arguments were anyway. Or does every individual have a right to vote? And is that going to split the family? Nowadays, no one would. We just don't. None of us do. You don't. I don't know. We just can't fathom that way of thinking. That a family would go, "This is our position," and the husband's going to vote. Like, it just feels really weird to us. But that is how a lot of people thought, even 100 years ago in our country, let alone in many parts of the world. So that's just one very ordinary one.
Well, as you were talking, I remembered an example you gave from the book that I found so interesting, and that was the soccer player or the football player, the person who kicks the round ball.
You might say who hits the ball with their foot. That's right. Why we call it. Rather than the 90 players who seem to barely touch the ball and run around shoving it.
The footballer who got kicked out of a game because his opponent had said something about his sister, and so he headbutted him or did something to kick out of the game.
Yeah, Zinedine Zidane, he was the best player in the world, and he got sent off during the World Cup final because he headbutted someone who offended his sister. And Western people watch that and go, "You loon! Well, surely a bit of self-discipline would realise that it was more important to win the national tournament than it was, most." And it's probably the biggest, most prestigious prize in world sport, the World Cup football final. Yeah, and you get sent off because someone said, "You just suck it up." And of course, much of the world is watching that same incident, going, "Of course you defend the honor of your sister. Doesn't matter where it is. That matters far more than." And it's just one of those things where Western people's take on it is so different from much of the world. And then we almost find it baffling that other people don't see it the same way. It's really interesting.
Yeah, this may not be a good use of our limited time, but I still want to know, since I've got you, in sort of an offhand comment, as you were listing all the things that were affected by our weirder view of the world, and there are the obvious things like sexuality and identity, but you sort of offhand just mentioned and sport, and then you didn't really. I mean, this example here, somewhat. I mean, it applies. What did you have other things in mind about the way our weird?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could start with. So bear in mind, I'm now generalizing about the Western world. Your nation is a complete outlier here because obviously you don't play the same. You play your own sports, and with the exception of basketball, nearly everyone else in the world doesn't play the sports that you do, or it's a very, very minority interest in most nations. But the sports that most nations play, and including your own, of course, which are then Western, the fact that people in the South Sea Islands are playing British sports rather than British people are playing what South Sea Islanders were playing in the 18th. We have actually picked up one of them, which is surfing. Yeah. Which of course they invented. But the fact that we have, my island effectively has exported most of the sports that people in the world play. And even, of course, what we would call American football is itself, is still connected organically to the codification of football in the 19th century. And so some of it is just what the sports are. Okay. Some of it is the code of those sports and the way that sport functions as is not an original thought to me, but a sublimating of male violence, really, that it's a way of trying to build an honor code without having to get everybody killed. Partly the way that the commercialization and expansion of sport and the class dynamic, what began in my country anyway, sort of, often was a very sort of Christian and working class movement as a way of getting people to spend their time in productive ways so they don't drink too much or whatever it might be, but has gradually become commercialized, is a window through which you can tell the story of the modern West and how economics drowns out Christianity in the end. Or that. So there's so many ways in which you can see sport as just it's a very accessible window through which we can see lots of other larger social trends. And I'm by no means an expert on it, but I do think it's a very interesting one, even, for a British person looking at the way American sport works and seeing the way that what looks to us like, apart from the fact that we don't understand how the games work, and no doubt that's mutual, you don't probably understand cricket either. But it looks very exploitative to us to have these enormously cash generative college football programs, which people aren't paid to play, and it's very dangerous. So, but even those things give a window into the way what culture values and how culture has basically money has swallowed nearly all other values. And it's just quite a good parable of modern industrial Western technology and economic growth. So those are some of the things I was thinking of.
Yeah. I was in Dublin last summer, and we were there on successive Sundays through a strange, I'll spare you the details. But anyway, the first Sunday we were there, they were playing the championship for Gaelic football. And the second Sunday they were playing the championship for hurling. And they had a stadium set aside for, you couldn't play any British, any sports that came from England. They played, regular football, but they didn't play in that stadium because that was for their Irish sports.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a long history of Anglo-Irish relations, which should give you, I'm sure you found out plenty of context as to why that's true.
Yeah. But I also loved we're going way down a rabbit trail. We would need to cut all this out probably, but the fact that the footballers or the hurlers, if you played for County Cork, you had to really be from County Cork, and it was very not just amateur, but very localized. No recruiting, no trading. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We should move on. Ex-Christian. Now, by saying, I assume you said ex-Christian instead of post-Christian, mostly because it fit in with your background.
It starts with an E. It's nothing more fancy.
So you don't mean anything different from what other people mean when they say post-Christian. No. But I have to say, I appreciated that language of ex-Christian as distinct from post-Christian, insofar as we're accustomed to the idea that when you're an ex something, if you're an ex-wife, your life is still very much shaped by the husband that you're not the wife of anymore. Yeah. Whereas post, that language to me feels like we left that behind. And your point of being when you say a culture is ex-Christian, it's still very, very much shaped by Judeo-Christian tradition. Yeah,
and I think the way that's very interesting. I've not heard anyone yet pick up on the idea that ex and post have slightly different connotations, which I hadn't spotted that actually. It wasn't intentional, but I think you're right, they do. And I think for me, I mean, the way I try and word it is I want to put the accent on the word Christian rather than the word ex. So it's not that we are ex-Christian in the sense that we've abandoned everything to do with it. It's that we are ex-Christian as opposed to ex-communist or ex-animist or ex-Muslim or ex-Hindu or whatever, as in the belief system that has shaped all of the institutions and all of the assumptions. And, I can see a painting on the wall behind you and the books behind you. And Christianity has shaped all of those things, whether they're Christian books or not, in all sorts of ways, in a way that animism, say, or Islam almost certainly have not, even if the books are about Islam or animism. And that's what I mean, that the accent is ex-Christian. It's like the belief system that we have tried to move beyond into the brave new world of sort of secular, liberal modernity or whatever, is a Christian worldview rather than something else. That's the angle on it. But obviously, the story of the book in part is about how the attempt to do that by moving beyond Christianity came about and reached in some ways its high point. That if you wanted the golden age of atheism, or people said, when would you as an atheist have felt most like, I think we're going to win this one, guys, in history? You might well have said the years immediately leading up to the French Revolution, or just before the Terror, probably. So the 20 years leading up to 1793 or so, I would think, I mean, Alistair McGrath does this in his book, The Twilight of Atheism. He says really high noon for atheism is about 1790, that kind of period. And what we now have is you have lots of people who they're not confessionally Christian, but they're not atheist in the same way that it would have felt like was on the resurgence in that decade. So, yeah,
and the values by which, the values by which our cultures criticize the church are the values
Yes.
of Christianity. I mean, it's,
Yes.
you remark that if a Viking were to somehow be reanimated and dropped into Scandinavia, which, you know, doesn't think of itself as an especially Christian nation, that Viking wouldn't know what was going on.
No,
Because
it would
the
feel
values.
incredibly Christian to be in, you know, even just the welfare state that we have in Europe. And I know it would be a little different in the States, but people from, if Asterix and Obelix were to wake up in modern France with all of its pretty robust secularism, they're one of the, you know, arguably the most thoroughgoing attempt to be secular, certainly in the West, in France.
Yeah.
But Asterix and Obelix would go, what on earth is this value system? This is so alien to them. And they would see it as Christian from top to bottom once they knew what Christianity was. And the same would be true, obviously, in Britain as well. So, that's a big part. I'm clearly not the first person to think of that or anything.
Sure.
It's a commonplace in people who write about it, but it's just interesting because to us, we feel a lot like, oh, well, Christianity's behind us. We've given it the boot, but it's still very, very here in the fabric of the way we think. Even the language of human rights, which most people wouldn't want to question, is Christian from top to bottom. Or where on earth did humans get these rights if we're just bundles of molecules fighting each other to have more offspring? It just doesn't follow, and yet that is how most people think. It wouldn't be something people would give any ground on at all, and that's a Christian conviction.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the idea of you speak of the fusion of a Christian and romantic influences. I guess maybe we need to back up and talk about what romantic is and how that's distinct from Christianity, but then how they get mixed up.
Yeah. So, I mean, romanticism is incredibly difficult to define, and I have an attempt at it in 8 words, beginning with I can't remember what they all are. Inwardness, infinity, ineffability, imagination, and a bunch of, anyway, those are, but I'm trying
You really are a preacher, aren't you?
Yeah, if you can't alliterate it, it isn't true. That's the rule. Yeah. Now that was a bit of fun. I think I got to about 6 in the list, and I thought, oh, they all start with I. Let's just make it work that way. But but it's very difficult to define. But I think we would know it. It's more easy to point out who was doing it. And so this is like, you know, the Schlegels and Wordsworth and Novalis and Coleridge, and then into Byron and Keats, and then the romantic musicians and romantic painters, and you know, Chopin and Liszt, and all of starting with Beethoven and on that movement. And but at the same time, one of the arguments I make there is that these sort of 2 huge forces that shape the creative life in the modern way, or a lot of our best art and most stimulating creativity, arises from, I think I picture it like the mingling of 2 great oceans. Christianity and Romanticism have a lot of tensions built into them, which drive a lot of the most creative and interesting artistic things people in the West do. And so there are tensions, for instance, between self-sacrifice and self-actualization. Mm-hmm. So in Romanticism, you know, the idea of actually, you know, and this again in the book, the period I cover in the book, someone like Rousseau is like, I'm just going to study myself. That's I'm going to retreat into myself. Or Goethe, you know, I return into myself. I find a world. So this is very 1770s, early Romanticism. The most interesting thing in the world there is me. It's the inner me, and that's what I'm going to discover and then give to the world as a gift almost. And so that's a sort of vision of self-actualization, self-discovery. Christianity is the language of self-sacrifice. It's the language of renouncing yourself, forget yourself and follow me. And the fusion between those 2 drives a lot of the most interesting art we have, because just stated that way, most great stories, novels, sometimes even you can see to a degree in music, but certainly in the big stories, plays, films, the tension between somebody saying, am I going to give myself up for someone I love, or am I going to actualize myself or am I going to try and find a way of doing both? And that creates a lot of the drama that we love. And that would be one tiny example, but many, many of them, the very tense, a lot of tension between attitudes towards sex and sexuality, or relationships, or marriage. You know, you have a romantic vision. This is, you know, you follow your heart wherever it leads. You have a Christian vision. You say you remain faithful to commitments. And that, again, drives a lot of the most interesting plays, books, stories that have been written in the last 200 years. And so I give lots of examples in the second chapter you referred to earlier. You know, Harry Potter, or the movie 1917, or Hamilton, or like all sorts of, you know, the Hilary Mantel's books. And just ways of saying, the West Wing. Lots of they just think this is what happens when Christianity and Romanticism collide.
The Barbie movie.
And both of those things have their root in 1776.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen the Barbie movie, but there's plenty of that in the Barbie movie too.
I haven't yet, actually, no. Yeah. The problem is once you've seen it, you really do see it everywhere.
Right.
Because I don't very often go to the cinema, so I chose Oppenheimer, which I really love. But I can imagine from the reviews I've seen, the Barbie movie is a great expression of that.
Casablanca, another one that's very much.
I'm also now. Many people will switch off now. I've never seen it.
Is that right?
So, okay. I just didn't. I didn't get into black and white movies when I was young, and I now hardly ever watch them. So
yeah,
my confession.
All right. You've already touched on. You've already started down the road of identity, and this is a podcast for sort of the target audience. The center of the target is people who are interested in the creative process, creative work, and you're sort of scratching that itch already. So can we talk a little bit about identity? The weirder sense of identity that we take as kind of normal. For people who do creative work, identity is all mixed up with the work, and the floor is open. I don't know what you're right. you wrote this book, and you know what it's like to have some of your identity wrapped up in that work. What kind of insights do these ideas give us?
So this is a slightly annoying someone who's just written a lot about something thing to say, but I think one of the things you have to do is you have to just ask quite big questions about even what you mean when you're talking about identity, and actually how most people in history have not talked that way. I remember hearing it's unfair because he's a good friend of mine, but he won't listen to this podcast, so it doesn't matter. And him saying something like, he was on a pastor's training course I run, and he said, the New Testament is all about identity. I said, the New Testament never mentions identity. It's just not a category people used in the ancient world. That is just fascinating how people would think it was, because they would say, I am in Christ or something like that, and they'd say, there you go, it's identity language. You think, no, you imported that. So I think sometimes what I think people mean when they say finding your identity in your work or your creative work, I assume what they mean, or what I mean if I was to say that, would be I am at risk of getting my validation, my affirmation, and my sense that my life is meaningful from my creative work. That's what I would assume someone meant, but it may not be quite even what you mean. I don't know. But is that a fair?
That's fair. Yeah.
So I think if I would start there actually, and then say, what do we mean? Because sometimes I was in a discussion about identity just last night in my church, and someone said that even saying I am X isn't to make a statement of identity. I think that's not how I use language at all. I am a homeowner, or I am white, or I just don't see those things as being, they're true, but they're trivially true to me.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think identity implies something very, very deep in part of you, and particularly artistic folk rightly see that as a very important thing they've been given to steward. But if you start to see your creativity as your identity in a sort of theological sense, like the most important truth about me is that I'm a writer or something, I think that's just fundamentally not a Christian way of thinking.
Sure.
Because the most important thing about you is that you're united with Christ and in him. So that I'd start there. But I think if what people mean, and I assume it is I am at risk of feeling too much validation from creative work, I totally relate to that and am concerned by it. And the bigger the project is, the longer it takes, and the more nervous you are about whether or not people will like it, the more that becomes true. And I think it is a battle of which I'm probably to some degree even waging at the moment, because I'm in this particular period now. A lot of this time was lockdown. It was me and my computer and books, and going home and telling my wife, and her going, okay, that sounds interesting, but why again are we talking about voyages in the South Seas or industrial, how they made a steam engine? And I'm thinking, I've just got to trust that someone's going to find this interesting in 3 years' time. Well, we've now reached 3 years' time, and the validation either comes now or it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I'm very aware of that tension and can thoroughly relate to it. And I think there is a continual battle, as there is with any work, to not derive your sense of value from what you've achieved, but from who you are in Christ and for what Christ has done for you. But I think creatives find that particularly difficult because, and I don't really identify as a creator. I write, but I don't think that's the main thing about me. But I find it particularly difficult because so much of the process is very nebulous, and the only thing you have to show for it is a creation. Yeah. You can't say, oh, well, on the way to doing this, I fed this many people, I generated this amount of heat, your activity, or I even just created widgets. You say, no, I didn't. The only thing I did was this artistic thing, which is very difficult to get any value on without someone else saying, that really helped me, or I loved it. And so we're probably more inclined than most to find validation in the opinion of someone else of our own work than someone who makes widgets or food or whatever, most things people make. So I suspect there's if you write a piece of music, it has got no functional utility except in lifting the human soul. So it's very difficult to know without personal feedback from someone whether or not it's actually worked. So we're very vulnerable to reviews and no doubt sales. And if you do concerts or play, applause, all those sorts of things, I think that is a creative person is more vulnerable than most to that phenomenon because of the nature of the work.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned sales. I mean, even that model, even that metric of success goes back to your weirder acronym, the Western values, the commercial values, all those.
I mean, so how does I think the greatest work of art that I've seen in person, by my judgment, but I know many would say it was those Michelangelo's Pieta, which he makes at 22, and it's sitting there in the Vatican, in St. Peter's, and you see it, and you just cannot understand how a human being can do that, let alone a 22-year-old. But his validation doesn't come from anything like that, sales tickets or even fame. I mean, he would have been relatively well known within a circle, but his fame is far greater now than it would have been then. Most people in the world would have no idea who Michelangelo was. So that sense, you're right, that's a way of appraising artistic merit is quite new. Like now, that of course we know, yes, you get reviews in these, and a review in this publication is far more meaningful than a review in that one, and sales, and we kind of mix that together to appraise ourselves. But that's, as you say, that's a very new way of appraising artistic merit.
Yeah. Okay. Can we? I'd like to address both writers of fiction and writers of, let's say, persuasive, essayists. Some of your insights around the remaking of our thinking, by way of 1776. Tell me about how does that affect the way we can be telling stories? Well,
I know nothing at all about the writing of fiction. I don't think I'd be able. I've got some friends who do. When I finished university, the friends who I remained in touch with, a number of them were in the sort of artistic world and wrote and still do write, plays and books and that sort of thing and stuff on TV and things. But they say, I have heard from them and found it thoroughly believable that plot was just. I remember asking them once, why do a lot of young poets, how can Keats write all these poems and die at 26? But that doesn't happen with novelists, or almost never does. Normally novelists, their great work comes later. So what is it about poetry? And he said, actually, it's because plot is just so hard. And it's getting good with language takes much less time than plot is not. Now, there's people here who know far more about this than me, but I might disagree. But when I heard that, I thought, oh, that does ring true, because of course, that's something I haven't had to learn how to do. I haven't had to cook up. I'm trying to narrate and pace a plot in a book like this, but it's all based on things that really happened. But kind of trying to invent plot I think is very, very hard. I think I probably think that the collision I talked about earlier between Romanticism and Christianity can be a helpful lens through which to view the creative process in that, or even storytelling, because it's so built around tension and tensions like the ones I mentioned. Is this person going to remain true to their commitments and obligations and duties, or are they going to be true to their feelings and instincts and desires? That's a classic sort of plot way of driving a plot. you have, is this person going, as I said, is this person going to sacrifice themselves, or are they going to actualize themselves, or both, and which is going to take precedence over which and why? And so I think that those two trends that have shaped who we are very significant for those of us who are trying to create plausible plots, stories, characters about human beings behave, and what inner dynamics there are. But to be honest, at anything more than at a practical level, I have no idea how to do that, and I just cannot but admire people who can write fiction, because I've never even tried, because I know I'd be terrible at it, and so I've written history instead. But I think it's finding an extraordinary process to see the result of it. How on earth did you come up with that? I think it's an amazing feat of human imagination.
Yeah. I do love that idea of acknowledging that tension. I think that's helpful to think as storytellers think about, add things to their tool pouch. Let's say that's a good thing to have there in the tool pouch. This idea of the conflict between self-sacrifice and self-actualization. Well, let's talk about persuasion then. This is a book. You make an argument in this book. This is a book that is intended to persuade, to understand the what you call the weirder vision of the world. How does that understanding shape the way we try to persuade other people?
I think it shapes. It's particularly helpful, I hope, in articulating the stories that people already believe, and therefore enabling us to find points of common ground and connection with those who we are hoping to persuade of something else. Because persuasion is an awful lot easier to do. I mean, I've used this line a few times in talking about the book. It's much easier to say to somebody, here's what you believe and here's why you're right, than to say, here's what you believe and here's why you're wrong. Now, persuasion is usually only something you try and do because you think they are wrong about something, even if it's a fairly trivial thing. But starting by saying, this instinct you have that X is true is a good one, but it only follows from this other thing, but because I now know what you believe, where I agree with you, I can then start there and work back to the thing that must therefore also be true. And so the better we understand that story or those cultural waters we're swimming in, the more likely we are to find connection points. And I think if we have a fairly narrow understanding of what people currently believe and live with, we'll find persuasion more difficult, because we will think, well, I just don't know enough to find where is the common ground. And we've all had conversations like this. We think, I'm talking to this person. I just think we're totally missing each other like ships in the night here.
Yeah. But
the more we have seen the wider story that they live in or make sense and how they make sense of the world, the more likely we are to say, oh, there's a connection, and to start from there to build out with a view to persuading, because I think that's where persuasion usually starts, is on common ground and then building out. So I think that's probably, I hope that's how a project like the one I've been working on, and obviously many others do, might be able to contribute to persuasion in that sense, in that it gives you common ground to start from in building a case to persuade somebody else. That's a very good question, really. It's not something I've thought a huge amount about. It's not why I've obviously wrote the book, but I do think it could help.
Yeah. Well, it's remarkable how little effort goes into persuasion in our public discourse, to actually trying to get someone to change their mind. I mean, in other words, we're a lot more interested in browbeating, I think, than we are in persuading. I think it's also helpful to acknowledge not just these other people have this, overly romantic view of who they are, and I need to therefore persuade. It's helpful for me to realize the extent to which I have an overly, or I have some of the things I think of as a Christian way of thinking about the world turns out to be Western, industrialized, romantic. I really appreciate the way that you help a reader like me. I don't like the word interrogate, but I'm going to use it just because it's what's coming to mind. Interrogate my own assumptions, because it really is easy to mistake Western for Christian, or for that matter, capitalist.
Yeah.
For Christian, if you're not thinking very hard about things.
Yes.
So.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that's just right out of the blue, and you can just tell me to forget it if you need to. Artificial intelligence, how does artificial intelligence fit into the schema that you have laid out here?
Well, obviously it doesn't, because in the sense that it was a development that's emerged obviously some way later. I don't think anyone was anywhere near there in the 1770s. I think in another way, it's obviously impossible to conceive of without several of those developments being what they are, particularly enrichment and industrialization, but probably also romanticism as well, in a way, in that I think I've come across the term excarnation in a number of writers, and I can't remember who started it. But the idea that sort of removing flesh, and minimizing the extent to which the individual needs to be embodied, is not only an industrial technological development, but it's also a philosophical and almost quasi-religious one, really, which is that we begin to say what really, again, if I were to go back, if I had to find someone in the 1770s who was writing that you think there's something AI-ish about this, I might go to someone like Rousseau, because he's saying, actually, I will retreat. I will spend some time with my own thoughts, thinking about me, and actually the me that I am out there in public, in the world, in the way others perceive me, is not really that important. And even, of course, there's some things like agnostic about that kind of, the embodiment of me is not the primary issue. It's really what's in the soul that matters. But actually, that's part of a broader philosophical shift in the West to sort of separate what John 1 would call word and flesh, isn't it? It's like, the word becomes flesh, but we're going, no, we're going to keep those two separate. What matters is the mind, the thought, the intelligence, the logos, rather than the sarx, the biological, physical, animated skin and bones reality. And so I think, although clearly AI is you would think the story of industrialization or enrichment are the two that most feed into it. I actually think Romanticism does as well, because the idea that people would think there was such a thing as intelligence that didn't have a body has got strangely sort of romantic-y and obviously in some ways Gnostic roots. The greatest brain we could get would be one that wasn't constrained by having to keep a body alive. Which is, of course, what computers initially and then now AI are. So I think there's probably several threads you could put on there. That's not something I've thought about in the book at all, of course, but it's just interesting to mull.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe we'll wrap up there, because I was not planning on keeping you even this long. But thank you, Andrew, for being here. It's great
to talk. Thank you so much for your time and the fascinating questions.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this book. I hope a lot of people read it.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.